'Twas the 6th of June in 44. I stood there on a foreign shore. I'd never been aboard before. I looked around, what did I see? White-faced young men, beached by cruel sea. They were alive the day before, but now no more. What price to pay to make us free? Many years have passed, yet still we pray for souls passed on from that D-Day.
Lots of bodies on the beach and even more bodies in the water. Lots of lads never even got to the shore.
There was probably 3 or 4 that got out of the landing craft, and I don't think any of them survived.
Think and think hard of the example which is being set for us by our own fighting men.
Here we are, together, defending all that to free men is dear.
Bombs, rockets, guns. I was lucky.
I can't imagine a more horrific thing to have to do, and it tells you so much about the bravery of these guys that they did it.
German guns, German bombs.
If you survived, you were just bloody lucky.
I can't really say that I was afraid of anything at all.
We knew where we were going because we had all that ammunition. So we knew that. We knew we were all going somewhere. Eventually, halfway across the channel, we learned we were going to Normandy. But where Normandy was, we had no idea.
The 6th of June, 1944. A day etched in history. A day that forever changed the course of humanity. As the sun rose over the shores of Normandy, the world witnessed the unwavering bravery of those who stormed the beaches, facing the full fury of war. As we commemorate the 80th anniversary, we honor not only the heroes who fought, but also the countless lives lost in the pursuit of freedom.
The 80th anniversary of D-Day is going to be really the last time there's going to be commemorations in which survivors of D-Day are going to be there. If you're 18 on D-Day, you're going to be 98 at the 80th anniversary. And there are still a few nonagenarians around who'll be there. But ultimately, this is going to be a really, really big and important commemoration.
For many, it was their first taste of combat, yet they marched forward with the hope of a better tomorrow. They were sons, brothers, husbands, and fathers. Ordinary men called upon to do extraordinary things.
After D-Day, it took freedom another year to reach the Elbe. It took another 44 years to reach Warsaw and Prague and East Berlin. And now it has reached Kiev and Moscow and even beyond.
I take it upon myself to express the immense debt of gratitude we owe to you all. I salute you and thank you on behalf of our whole nation.
It's often said that the generation who fought the Second World War, the generation that were on D-Day, are regarded as the greatest generation, and I'm not going to disagree with that. They were the greatest generation.
We stand in awe of their courage and resilience, humbled by their sacrifices. This is the story of D-Day, The year is 1943. The tide of the war is turning. The enemy has surrendered in North Africa. The Red Army continues to slaughter German troops on the Eastern Front, retaining key cities such as Stalingrad and Kursk. The Allied powers have successfully invaded Sicily, leading to the fall of the fascist dictator Benito Mussolini. On the 28th November, Churchill, Stalin and Roosevelt meet at the Tehran Conference in Iran. The Big Three know that an Allied invasion of France cannot wait. Hitler must be brought to his knees, once and for all.
1943 sees this really crucial conference at Tehran, the capital of Iran. And that's where Churchill, Roosevelt and Stalin all meet each other in person for the first time. Now, Stalin is very impatient. He's saying to Roosevelt and Churchill, listen, I've been fighting Nazi Germany and have lost millions of men and women since 1941. And his attitude is slightly, what are you guys up to? When are you going to mount your big second front against the Nazis in Europe? Yeah, all right, well done in Africa, well done, in Italy, but that's not going to change things. What you've got to do is invade northern France and make your way through to Germany so we can squeeze Hitler like this. And that is essentially what happens at Tehran. It's a lot of negotiation, power play between the three biggest Allied figures on the planet.
It will not be by German hands that the structure of Europe will be rebuilt.
By early 1944, the world had been at war for, 5 years? And during that time, we'd seen the Nazi empire expand massively, but then by about 1942, the tide begins to turn. Hitler is now starting to be really squeezed. But what needs to happen still is a massive Allied invasion of Northern Europe, an invasion that needs to push its way all the way through to the heart of the Third Reich, and that, of course, is the Nazi capital, Berlin. Berlin has to fall.
In the early months of 1944, Allied leaders embarked on a monumental endeavour, crafting blueprints for what would become the most colossal amphibious invasion in history. Codenamed Overlord, this operation symbolised not just a military campaign, but an epoch-defining mission of unparalleled scale and significance. Known for his tact and diplomacy, General Dwight D. Eisenhower was appointed Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Forces and quickly got to work on finalising the operation. Allied leaders also selected the British General, Bernard Montgomery, as Commander-in-Chief of the Allied ground forces for the invasion. Alongside Eisenhower, he made major contributions to the shape of Overlord and the overall campaign in northwest Europe.
Now, the great thing when you go fighting, of course, my business, as you know, is fighting. Fighting the Germans. Or anybody else, too, who wants to have a fight.
General Eisenhower was a man who had started off the Second World War as a colonel. And by the time 1944 arrives, he's become the supreme commander of Allied forces in Europe. So he's an incredibly skillful, very able commander and draws an enormous amount of respect.
Teamwork wins wars. I mean teamwork among nations, services, and men.
After the US president and Churchill, he's probably the most important person in all the Allied forces. General Montgomery was a very successful, highly well-regarded British general. He had been a victor at El Alamein in North Africa. He was very much loved by his fighting troops. He was a bit of a controversial figure, though. He was considered quite vain, and many of his officers and his colleagues thought him a very divisive and very problematic figure. But nevertheless, he's going to have to work very closely with Eisenhower to make D-Day a success.
By early June, the number of troops present in Britain reached more than 2 million Americans and 150,000 Canadians. Millions of supplies were shipped over, including more than 450,000 tons of ammunition.
The Allied preparations for Operation Overlord were absolutely immense. You've got to imagine that the whole of southern England is basically turned into a kind of holding area for millions of troops, hundreds of thousands of vehicles, tanks, you name it, all the way along the seaboard. You've got landing craft, naval ships. I mean, this is truly the best part of an entire country basically being turned into a huge military base. The world had never seen anything like it, because this was going to be the biggest amphibious invasion ever carried out in the history of mankind.
Vast preparations were being made. Huge quantities of material and supplies collected. Guns, half-tracks, bombs, ambulances.
You've got to remember that going across the Atlantic during the Second World War was a really hazardous business, because under the waves you have all these packs of German U-boats, submarines, patrolling the waters, ready to torpedo any merchant ship full of all that lovely cargo at the drop of a hat. Getting those supplies to Britain is not an easy task. And had Britain and America lost the war in the Atlantic, then they would have lost the Second World War. Why? Because they would not have had the material needed to invade Nazi-held Europe.
The Allies tirelessly readied themselves for the imminent assault, determined to dismantle the Third Reich and bring Hitler's Nazi dictatorship crumbling down.
Of the fascist nations in Europe today, Germany emerges as the supreme example. Democracy is destroyed. The dictator is a demigod who can do no wrong. Propaganda dominates the nation's mind. Nazi Germany faces her destiny with one of the great war machines in history.
In the early 20th century, Adolf Hitler's ability to rally support among his people was unparalleled, earning him a place as one of history's most formidable dictators.
Sie täuschen sich alle, die glauben, dass auch nur ein Riss in das Gefüge unserer einzigen Bewegung gekommen sei. Sie steht fest, so wie dieser Block hier.
However, as the year 1944 dawned, the once unassailable power of the Führer began to waver. Within the echelons of the German High Command, loyalty waned, and doubts regarding Hitler's prowess as a military leader spread throughout the Third Reich like wildfire.
There were many senior figures in the German armed forces who were very, very privately negative about Hitler's military leadership. Hitler saw himself as a kind of tactical and strategic genius. And he would look at maps at his generals and he would tell them what's what. But the generals, they knew that some of the things he was asking them to do were just futile and hopeless. So there's a lot of negativity buzzing around the German High Command. The Allied commanders knew that Hitler was seriously overstretched. He was fighting this kind of life and death struggle on the Russian front. He had lost in North Africa, he was fighting in Italy. There was a lot for Hitler to contend with. And so what they knew is that Hitler was in a relatively weak position. If a new front was going to be started in France, then Hitler was going to really struggle.
After much deliberation, it was decided that the landings would take place on the long, sloping beaches of Normandy. There, the Allies would have the element of surprise.
One of the reasons why the Allies chose Normandy was because they knew that the point closest to Britain, which of course is Calais in northern France, was really heavily fortified. And the Allies had also carried out a lot of deception operations and had managed to hoodwink Hitler into believing that when the invasion came, it would take place at Calais. Now, as a result, the Germans massively fortified the whole Calais area, and they don't fortify Normandy quite so heavily. And so that's a really, really big reason why Normandy was chosen. But also Normandy has these great big open, flat beaches that, even though they're heavily defended, are relatively easy to land on, just in terms of their actual kind of layout, if you like. So that's another reason. And also, all that kind of seaboard along Normandy represents a really great open area where you can start unloading, an enormous amount of men and machinery, tanks, you name it. So actually, it's the ideal landing spot. Calais would have been, all a bit too cramped and a bit too heavily defended.
For quite a while, we brought most supplies right over the open beach, like we'd practiced it and like we'd made up as we went along. We worked a 24-hour shift. Ducks, lights, rafts, rowboats, all sorts of Rube Goldbergs. The stuff just kept pouring in. Tanks, trucks, food, ammo, guys, millions of things.
In the build-up to the invasion, the Allies orchestrated Operation Bodyguard, a masterful strategy aimed at deceiving the Germans regarding the timing and whereabouts of the primary Allied landings. As tension mounted, the Allies skillfully maneuvered in the shadows, weaving a web of misinformation to cloak their true intentions, setting the stage for one of history's most pivotal moments.
In the run-up to D-Day, the Allies realised they're going to have to con the Germans as to what was going on. So there were lots of deception operations carried out. So you have things like inflatable tanks. So when any German flying over would look down and think there are even more tanks than there actually were. You have all sorts of deception operations carried out by spies and intelligence agents to tell the Germans, or to indicate to the Germans, that the invasion is going to take place at Calais and not Normandy. And there were also deception operations carried out to make the Germans think that actually an invasion would happen in Norway. All these things add up to try and hold up German troops in the place where the invasion was not going to take place. They were diversion tactics, essentially, and they worked really well.
Operation Bodyguard became the pinnacle of military deception. The Allies even went as far as employing a phantom army led by George Patton and releasing false radio transmissions. Double agents spread misinformation in Berlin and across the Third Reich, sowing doubt about the true landing site. This strategic web of deceit paved the way for the invasion's remarkable triumph.
We have certainly a most encouraging example here of what can be achieved by British and Americans working together, heart and hand.
Western Europe had remained a fairly relaxed front for the Axis powers throughout the war so far. Yet, this apparent calmness did not hinder Germany's readiness to thwart any potential invasion attempts.
In public, Hitler assured the Germans, "Mr. Churchill tells his people that England will win, but I tell you that victory will belong to Germany."
In a bold move, Hitler issued Führer Directive No. 40 in 1942, kick-starting the construction of fortifications. Thus, the legendary Atlantic Wall emerged, a sprawling network of coastal defences spanning over 1,600 miles across the Western Front. Fused with firepower, formidable fortifications, and an army of manpower, Hitler's Atlantic Wall stood as a testament to engineering prowess, casting a shadow of impenetrability over the 20th century battlefield.
The Atlantic Wall was this huge series of fortifications that stretched all the way from the very north of Norway all the way down to the Pyrenees with the border of Spain and France. And it was built by basically hundreds of thousands of forced and slave labourers at the instruction, at the command of the Nazis, in order to fortify occupied Europe against any Allied invasion. And the Atlantic Wall was basically just what it sounds. It was basically a huge concrete wall, thousands and thousands of miles long, complete with tons of different types of defences. So of course you have, massive guns built into it, machine gun nests, you have tank traps, ditches. This was a huge undertaking, and it was there to kind of provide security to the Germans to say, listen, Europe is impregnable against the British and the Americans. Any invasion is just going to run into this wall, and that's going to be the end of it. So this is a huge project that takes years and years to build, and you can still see so many remnants of it today because these massive bits of concrete are basically impossible to get rid of. Because there was this imminent threat of invasion of Northern Europe from 1943, Hitler appoints one of his top generals, that's Erwin Rommel, to strengthen the Atlantic Wall. He sees this as a really crucial job to do. The whole thing is a complete network, an array, dizzying array of all sorts of defences. So it's not just a concrete wall, it's a lot more complicated than that. And I don't really think that you'd want to be a soldier coming up against it.
From the 1st of April to the 5th of June 1944, a staggering 11,000 aircraft took to the skies, releasing 195,000 tons of bombs upon French rail centres and road networks. This relentless assault effectively cut off the invasion area from the rest of France. The valour and determination of the Allied Air Force set the stage for the triumph of the D-Day invasion, even before a single soldier set foot on the beach.
In order to prepare for D-Day, the Allies mount this enormous bombing campaign of northern France. They want to take out as many facilities that are useful for the Germans as possible. So they're going to take out factories, they're going to take out bridges, they're going to take out, obviously German units if they possibly can. This is a way of basically giving the Germans a complete pasting before the invasion happens. But of course, what also happens, if you're bombing occupied France, you're also going to kill the locals, you're going to kill French people. And this is a really, really horrific and tragic side effect to this bombing campaign. But at the time, without laser-guided GPS munitions, accurate bombing was simply not possible. So of course, if you're aiming for a bridge, all the town around the bridge is probably going to get hit as well. So this is a big problem, but the Allies can see no other way.
The Allies' air campaign emerged as a crucial triumph. With D-Day looming on the horizon, commanders rallied their troops in anticipation of the pivotal moment. The young men across the Channel geared up for what would be the most monumental day of their lives. In the days beforehand, Allied commanders completed the last-minute arrangements for what would become the most extensive military operation in history. Awaiting the armada of ships and tanks were 5 Normandy beaches, Omaha and Utah for the Americans, Sword and Gold for the British, and Juno for the Canadians. However, fate had other ideas for the Allies. June 1944 took a turn for the worse as storm clouds blanketed the channel, throwing a wrench into Eisenhower's plans.
The weather is the one thing that the Allied commanders can't control. And on the 5th of June, it is seriously stormy. They have to delay. But obviously, they can't just sit around for ages and ages and ages, because boats are going to run out of fuel, everyone's on standby, things have got to happen. But of course, Eisenhower knows that if he launches this invasion during a storm and he loses hundreds of thousands of men to the storm, then D-Day will fail. And if D-Day fails, that's going to change the course of the war, and with it, world history. And so they have to make a decision. Are they going to go tomorrow? And it's up to this man called James Stagg, who's the chief meteorologist. And he's got an enormous decision to make, a recommendation of what he's going to do. He's got 3 separate teams, all giving him 3 separate forecasts. Remember, there is no long-range forecasting in 1944. There are no satellites. There are no computer models that you can draw on. You can only really accurately forecast up to 2 days ahead. After that, it's just pointless.
Both Rommel and Hitler were convinced that the stormy weather would halt any Allied attacks. However, what German meteorologists failed to anticipate was a break between the 2 storms, providing the perfect opportunity for the Allies to launch an invasion.
Stagg says to Eisenhower, Montgomery and the Allied leaders, I think there's going to be a break in the weather on the 6th of June, and I think that's the day we've got to go. And Eisenhower looks at him and goes, I think you're right.
Shortly after midnight on the 6th of June, Allied airborne troops began dropping behind enemy lines. Their mission: to blow up bridges, sabotage railroad lines, and prevent the enemy from rushing reinforcements to the invasion beaches.
It was decided that as the attack took place on the battery, 3 gliders full of volunteers, all single men, would land on top of the battery armed with submachine guns and flamethrowers and create as much havoc as possible. The job was suicidal. My commanding officer admitted this to me only 10 years ago. Didn't I know that it was a suicide mission?
The Allies had air superiority over northern France, and so the night before D-Day, they were able to drop lots of men, lots of paratroopers behind the German defences. So of course, it's one thing just to punch your way against the Atlantic Wall, but it's also quite clever to land behind it. And so you're already kind of pincering and encircling the German defenders. And of course, what it's also going to do is create tons and tons of confusion behind German lines. So actually what you're doing is really going to cause mayhem. So those landings at night before the actual amphibious invasion are a crucial part of D-Day.
Rommel had opened the sluice gates of the River Dives, and the whole area was flooded. There were many irrigation ditches there, and the battalion had lost a lot of men in the ditches. And we finished up in one of those ditches, 7 feet deep, me with a flamethrower on my back weighing 120 pounds and going blub, 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 blub. How we got out of it, I shall never know.
Perhaps my most vivid memory was as we flew in. I was dumping number 1, and I could see a white line below us and realized this surf breaking on the Normandy coast, and we'd be jumping in a couple of minutes' time.
As well as dropping real live human beings, the Allies were also dropping dummy paratroopers to hoodwink the Germans that the invasion force was even bigger. Remember, all this is happening at night. It's all incredibly confusing for the Germans. Suddenly all these planes are flying over, paratroopers are dropping everywhere. What the hell is going on? You could imagine the confusion and, frankly, the fear felt by the German defenders.
Soldiers, sailors, and airmen of the Allied Expeditionary Force, you are about to embark upon the great crusade toward which we have striven these many months. The eyes of the world are upon you. the hopes and prayers of liberty-loving people everywhere march with you. In company with our brave allies and brothers in arms on other fronts, you will bring about the destruction of the German war machine, the elimination of Nazi tyranny over the oppressed peoples of Europe, and security for ourselves in a free world. We will accept nothing less than full victory, and let us all beseech the blessing of Almighty God upon this great and noble undertaking.
The first wave of the amphibious invasion landed on Omaha Beach at around 6:30 a.m. By nighttime, nearly 133,000 troops had made their way across the channel to the shores of Normandy. What they witnessed could only be described as hell on earth.
Lots of bodies on the beach, and even more bodies in the water. Lots of lads never even got to the shore.
There was probably 3 or 4 that got out of the landing craft, and I don't think any of them survived.
An armada of more than 3,000 landing craft, 2,500 ships, and 500 naval vessels arrived at the German-controlled shores. A sight to behold in modern military history.
All the guys in these landing craft were kind of being sick all over, the floor of the craft, into their helmets. Seawater was coming in. The whole place really stank. And then what happens when you reach the beach at the other end and that ramp goes down to enable you to run off onto the beach and storm the German positions? You are met not by a friendly wave, but you are met by a hail of machine gun fire, some of which is just going to cut straight into your boat and kill all of you. And then you've got to wade through the water all the time under fire from those Germans on the Atlantic Wall, and you've got to run across the beach with all your kit. You're soaking, you're still feeling sick, you're frightened, you're terrified, and all this time you're being fired upon, the guys next to you are being blown up, body parts are flying everywhere. It is absolutely horrific and it's terrifying, and frankly, for my money, I can't imagine how anybody managed to make it up to the other end of the beach.
Ablaze with bombs, rockets, guns. I was lucky. One of the other destroyers next to us was torpedoed and sank within 5 minutes. I can remember bracing my knees and holding on to something just in case we were hit as well.
Once landed, the troops across 5 beaches raced to take out the brutal German machine gun nests, concrete bunkers and pillboxes, all whilst avoiding millions of landmines and the continuous flow of bullets. The Germans proved unable to withstand the advancing Allies. Hitler and his high command had failed to impede the invasion.
You need belief in your cause, in your leaders, in your training, and in the comrades around you. And above all, you need belief in yourself. And if you overlay all this with a thin veneer of arrogance, then you've got a first-class unit.
The terror of it, and the sheer violence and noise and disorientation, and the fear, and how any of them managed to make it up to the fortifications to actually then begin to engage with the Germans, frankly, is a miracle. I'm amazed it wasn't more of a slaughter than it was.
More than 4,400 soldiers perished on D-Day, with Omaha Beach being the bloodiest of the battles, a price worth paying in the eyes of the Allied command.
Immediately, the business of evacuation begins. Worst wounds get first priority. Right back they go to the boats that landed them but a short time before. This is part of the plan. Where the LSTs are unable to come in close enough, the smaller craft are used to get the wounded to them.
In their ignorance, the top of the German command were nowhere to be seen.
One of the biggest problems that besets the Germans is inactivity at the very highest level. You have Rommel at his wife's birthday, and you have Adolf Hitler fast asleep. Hitler's one of these people who goes to bed very late and he gets up very late, and no one wakes him up. No one dares wake him up because they're not sure whether this is the big invasion or just some diversionary attack.
Disagreements further arose over the positioning of the Germans' key panzer divisions. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt advocated placing the panzer divisions further inland, away from the reach of Allied naval guns. However, Erwin Rommel opposed this strategy, arguing that Allied air superiority would render flanking attacks impossible, and insisted on positioning everything up front, including the panzers. He asserted that the invasion must be stopped within the first 24 hours, or not at all. Ultimately, the decision rested with the Führer.
Hitler was always arguing with his generals. He wanted the panzer divisions near Calais, Rommel wanted them somewhere else. You know, there were constant disagreements going on between Hitler and the high command. And it's, you know, had the generals had their way, then it's possible that D-Day would have been a lot tougher for the Allies than it actually was. So one of the biggest helpers that the Allies actually have during D-Day is Adolf Hitler himself, because he always gets it wrong. What Hitler decides to do is to split the difference. It's basically a terrible act of indecision. Rather than commit all those divisions to Normandy to repel the invasion, he holds many of them back near Paris, and that's going to really help the Allies.
On D-Day, commanders on the ground in Normandy pleaded with Hitler to release some panzer divisions and divert the standing army at Calais in order to slow the invasion inland.
It's only the insistence of his senior commanders that makes Hitler release these divisions. They're saying, look, we've just got to have them. There's no good them just sitting all the way back there. You've got to move them. And Hitler eventually relents. It takes a lot to change his mind, but it works.
The mistakes made by the German command opened the doors for the Allies. By the end of D-Day, the Allies' gamble had paid off. British, Canadian, and American units began making their way inland, fighting off the Germans from every angle. The young men had come this far. They were not going to give up now.
After the Allies successfully land on D-Day and start using those beaches to, get tons and tons of men and material, into northern France, what now follows is the Battle of Normandy. And that is a very, very attritional, tough battle. And one of the reasons for that is because the Normandy countryside, the bocage as it's called, is sort of undulating, and it's got lots and lots of hedgerows you can hide behind. It is almost like urban warfare, but in the countryside. Lots of places to hide, lots of places for snipers, lots of ditches, lots of hedgerows, lots of woods, lots of copses. It's very, very difficult. And as a result, it becomes a very long and drawn out battle that's going to cost a lot of lives on both sides.
Canadian, British, and American units fought hard to take key cities and towns across the Normandy region. The battles were often bloody, exhausting, and could last for weeks at a time.
Normandy was littered with really tactically useful locations that the British had to capture. So Cherbourg, a major port even today, that has to be captured if you want to unload supplies, for the big effort. So, that's one place you've got to capture. Then you've got this big stronghold just a few miles inland called Caen. And Caen was really heavily bombed by the Allies in order to get rid of the Germans.
The fighting in Normandy continued for 2 more months after D-Day. 425,000 Allied and German troops were killed, wounded, or went missing during the battle. The Allied bombings also killed around 20,000 French citizens, many of whom were in hiding from Nazi forces.
With two great amphibious landings, followed by one of the most powerful, most brilliantly executed military campaigns of history, the Allies round out their master plan for the liberation of France and the crushing of the German enemy in the West.
A little more than 2 months after the triumph of the D-Day landings, Allied forces finally liberated Paris on the 19th of August 1944. 4 long years of Nazi occupation had left the capital city in ruins, with many citizens suffering from starvation, limited freedom, and even homelessness.
The liberation of Paris is, of course, an absolutely symbolic moment for the Allied invasion. Hitler had ordered the Germans there to basically destroy the city, to flatten it, rather than let it fall into Allied hands. But the German garrison there realises that as the Allies approach, they're not going to win, they're going to be encircled. What you might end up with is going to be a kind of siege, people are going to starve. And so, of course, when the Allies do go into Paris, and the Free French forces go into Paris, and General de Gaulle, the leader of the Free French, goes into Paris, this is a hugely symbolic moment. France had been humiliated by Hitler in 1940. You know, those images of Hitler posing near the Eiffel Tower, of course, represented utter capitulation. And so, for that swastika to come down off the Eiffel Tower and be replaced by the French tricolour was a hugely morale-boosting moment and really showed that D-Day and the tide of war were going the way of the Allies.
The liberation of Paris and numerous towns and cities throughout France signalled the culmination of the largest conflict in history. However, it took until the following year for full Allied victory in Europe.
Make no mistake, D-Day is a very, very big nail in the coffin for the Axis war effort. There is no way that Hitler can win the war now on 2 fronts. Ultimately, Hitler is now being squeezed in a massive, massive continental vice. He's got Stalin from the east, he's got the Americans and the British and other allies from the west. That is just going to be absolutely unstoppable. And so D-Day is one half of that unstoppable force. It is a massive moment.
By April 1945, 3 million Soviet troops dealt brutal blows to the last traces of the German resistance, while the Western Allies moved across the Rhineland. With the Russians at the gates to Berlin, Adolf Hitler had nowhere to run, his power shrinking with every second that passed. On the 30th of April, he committed suicide in his bunker as the city at the heart of his 1,000-year Reich burned to the ground and crumbled in ruins around him. The war in Europe ended forever on the 8th of May 1945. Adolf Hitler's tyrannical rule was finally over. As time marches on, let us pause to remember the valour and sacrifices of those who stormed the beaches of Normandy 80 years ago. Many veterans have passed on now, but we cherish those who remain and honour their remarkable story.
D-Day is a pivotal moment in the Second World War, and as a result, it's a pivotal moment in world history. Everybody should know what the 6th of June 1944 represents. It is one of the major days in which freedom was regained.
was, before getting onto the boat, as far as you could see, the tide was out, and you could see nothing else but some of the crafts that have gone down. The first thing that comes into your mind are, you poor devils, all those that are in those craft, and there must be hundreds and hundreds of them. That also is D-Day itself. That morning of D-Day is my most vivid memory, and I will always remember that.
We treasure those who fought, and we really, really treasure those who died, who paid the ultimate price. Ultimately, war and being in a war is the worst lottery you can be involved in. You know, it's ultimately about luck. And those who died were just horrifically unlucky, and we have to remember them. And they've seen horrors and atrocities that, you know, we just can't begin in civilian life to imagine. So for that, we've always got to respect them. We've always got to remember those who charged across those beaches that morning so many years ago.
After nearly 80 years, I'm resting on my oars. I think of Thamesmen that I knew on D-Day's blood-red shores. For me, it's been a privilege to work with such good men, and if I had the option, I'd do it all again.